recording going. So we'll start by going over your first assignment for those of you who are here. So let me just get that up and running. Excuse me. um, so let's see who's here. Why aren't your names showing? Interesting. So there are three women who are actually visible, but I don't know why. I can't see your names. The other people's names who are not visible, I can see. Uh, Grace just turned hers on. You just turned yours on, so I can see you. Lovely young woman who has a sweatshirt, a hoodie on, and just hi. What's your name? Ah, there we go. Kat. Do you prefer Kat? Catherine?
My full name's
Katarina, sorry.
but Cat is
I
fine.
can't hear you.
Cat is fine.
Okay, now you're muted. Um, Let me know. Okay, young woman in a lovely young woman in a. I shouldn't say that. I'm going to start sounding like Trump, right? That's terrible. In a blue T-shirt with it looks like a clock. So I can't see your name.
Oh, that's
Isabel.
me. Yeah,
Isabel.
I'm
Okay.
Isabel. Yeah.
Now it must be on my. Huh. Okay. Hopefully I will be able to hear. I can see Grace and then. Okay. Woman in blue sort of jacket. Yes.
My name is Jessica.
Jessica. Okay. Got it. So Jessica, Isabel, Kat, Cecilia, and Grace. I can see. And how about the rest of you guys? Come on. Show yourselves. Okay. So let me get into Lightroom and let me share that with you guys. Just a moment. Okay. Come on. Come on. Okay, we'll go in alphabetical order, I guess, kind of. So, Katerina, Kat, um, we'll start with you, except I'm in. Let me get the. Sorry. Somehow I got this into the importing mode. Okay. So we are starting in Lightroom in the library module, which again is where we will be looking at where we look at our images, where we go through them, where we organize them, and so on. So I pulled your images into Lightroom so that we can see them. Uh, so, um, Pat, why don't you just say a little bit about your images? Anything you want to tell us about them? So we're starting here with bracketing.
I think the bracketing one is the one I had the hardest time with because my camera is really new and I didn't find a lot of the settings, even though I looked at the manual.
Okay.
So I kind of just tried to go off of your instructions. And since my backyard is the only place I have to take pictures, that's where I took them.
Right, I think that's true for many of us, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a look here. So we can see in the information here, and again, that's command, not command. So the letter I will bring up the information about the specific image. So this one was at 0, so presumably you were doing what the light meter said was correct.
Mm-hmm.
And then plus 1/3 and a minus 1/3. And can you guys all see this? I should have asked that already. You can all see Lightroom?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I would like you to have done more than 1/3 of a stop in either direction.
Okay.
Not because this isn't bracketing, it is. It's just that the differences are pretty subtle at 1/3 of a stop. And so for the assignment, I would like to have seen like a -1 stop and a +1 stop. If if for your own purposes, 1/3 of a stop works, that's great. And,
Mm-hmm.
the purpose of bracketing, of course, is to make an exposure that is correct, especially in lighting situations such as the ones that you have here, where there's a lot of contrast, a great difference between highlights and shadows. And so that's great. And we can certainly see a difference. It's just in the first set, maybe a little, you have to pay a little more attention. Okay. But certainly the minus on the right is darker than the plus 1/3 in the middle, and the highlights are more constrained.
Mm-hmm.
The shadows also are darker. And so later on in the term, we'll work with, and that's actually in the next week or two because it's a compressed term, we'll work with a way to put the images together so that we have the advantages of having detail in the highlights and detail in the shadows. And that's called high dynamic range, HDR. But anyway, good job, although subtle, on the first set. And let's see the second set. And so here you did 2/3, and that's definitely more obvious
Yeah.
what you did. Okay. Okay, great. So in the plus 2/3, we have very nice detail in the shadows. Excuse me. The highlights are very bright. In the minus 2/3, the highlights are great. They look normal, actually. And the shadows, we're losing shadow detail. So good job. Okay, equivalent exposures. And these look great, as I think I put in your comment. I would like just to have seen the whole stop numbers. You didn't need the in-between. So we didn't need, for example, at the top, F9 and F10, just from F8 to 11,
Mm-hmm.
16, and 22, and I think there's and 32. Okay. But that said, they are all, I think, with a slight exception at the beginning and end, all equivalent exposures. So in terms of light and dark, they're all the same.
Mm-hmm.
What I expected to see was a change in the depth of field, which of course is your next assignment. And I have to get these out of the way so I can get to the Lightroom controls. So if we come in close, oops. Sorry. There, I hit the wrong ones. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So we can see that though the exposures are the same in terms of light and dark, the depth of field in the image on the left is much greater than the image on the right. The image on the left being made with an aperture of f36, so very small, which gives us great depth of field, and the image on the right at f8, maybe not your smallest, no, not your smallest aperture, but considerably smaller f-stop number, excuse me, larger aperture than f36, and so the depth of field, as you can see, is much shallower, so the background is completely out of focus, and that's what I was looking for. Okay, and get out of that. And now ISO. So good job on these. Let me get to, again, I'm just looking at the extremes as, you know, to show us as examples. Mm. Let's see. So 32. So what I would like to have seen, and I thought it was here, was starting at a lower ISO rating. Let me just see what's going on here. Right. So I would like you to have started with the ISO at like 100 or 200, and then incrementally gone up with the whole stop numbers. So 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, 12,800, 25,600, which from about 3,200 on you got. I wanted to see the earlier ones as well, but let's compare the lowest and highest that you have. So 3,200, oops, try 2 to 1. And I think you can see, I hope you can see here, the difference. 3,200, there's a little bit of noise, you know, some roughness, but overall it looks pretty smooth. Whereas at 25,600 ISO, there's a lot of noise, so a lot of graininess, subtle changes in the colors that don't necessarily belong there. So we can still certainly see the difference between them. Okay. Okay. So thank you, Kat. And any other things to say? Anything you want to say about your images? I just kept going. I'm sorry. I should have let you speak a little bit for each section.
No, it's okay. I don't have anything to say.
If you do, and any of you, just interrupt me, okay? Start talking and I'll notice, I hope. All right. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's see who's next. Isabel. So, Isabel, speak to us, artist.
Um, so I just was reading my comments, and I should have done 2 sets of photos for my the bracketing assignment, but so I did 2 stops in each direction, so
Right.
it came out with a total of like 5. I ended up using my cat, and he like obviously wasn't staying still, but I was hoping that that would be okay.
That's fine. He stayed in one place, which can also
Yeah.
be kind of miraculous, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, you can definitely see a big change because, as Isabel said, she did 2 stops in either direction. So this image here, oops, let me get it back to the correct size. What in the world is that? Okay. So a 0 EV, which means that the exposure compensation was set to 0. So a 30th of a second at f5.6, ISO 3200. So inside, of course, is darker, and so Isabel needed to use a higher ISO rating in order to even really be able to shoot at all without a tripod. And even with the high ISO rating, the shutter speed is relatively slow, a 30th of a second, and the aperture is pretty wide open. Go back to this. So the 0 exposure, which means that she did what the light meter said was correct, looks good overall. The shadows are perhaps a little bit dark and the highlights a little bit light, but overall it looks good. As you can see, these 2 to the left, on the upper left, get darker. So a -1 and a -2. And the -2 is definitely dark. The highlights not unacceptably so, but the shadows have definitely done what's called blocking up. And that means that that you've lost the detail in those areas, which is what we'd expect to see. The -1 looks better. The highlights are brighter, obviously, but we can still see a bit of detail in the texture. And the shadows have opened up some, not as much as here at the normal, or 0. Then +1, the shadows have certainly opened up, and I don't know how dark your cat is. You know, if the cat is a kind of medium gray or actually is somewhat a little bit darker. But the highlights are way too bright, and at +2, everything is too bright. Now, that's, yeah, right. So you can see even more motion with the cat because the shutter speed is even slower at an 1/8 of a second. And so the slower the shutter speed, the more motion you'll record if there's something moving, of course. So often, usually, though not always, the +2 and -2 exposures are too much, too overexposed and too underexposed. But that's not true in 100% of cases where you're, trying to get a correct exposure in a difficult lighting situation. But the +1 and -1s definitely are acceptable images that can be worked on in Lightroom and in other applications. So if you're off in your exposure by 1 stop in either direction, in terms of being able to work on the image, there's no problem. There's still enough detail in the highlights and shadows to bring those out in Lightroom or in Photoshop or in, iPhoto or whatever Apple now calls its program, or any other basic application that in which you would work on images. +2, -2, +3, -3, those get to be the extremes. And when you greatly overexpose or underexpose, then you no longer are actually recording information in terms of color. So if we look at this image here, the +2, you can see that the background, the white areas that are the highlights, are so bright that they have essentially no color information anymore. And with the shadows, in the -2 areas, they're so dark that there no longer is color information, where even at, well, we'll go back to the normal one, those same areas that were black at -2 now have information in terms of color. Now, some of it's quite dark, a very dark gray, but other areas are not. And we can see that information. Whereas when you greatly overexpose or greatly underexpose, all of that color information disappears. Okay, so something definitely to be aware of when shooting and when working on your images. So I hope we can start working on images today in Lightroom, and you'll see that when an area is really, really bright and you want to bring it down darker, if there's no color information there, it just kind of goes gray. So anyway, we'll deal with that. Sorry, I've gone on and on. Okay, equivalent exposures. Anything to say, Isabel, about these?
Oh, not much to say about these. They were some flowers I found outside my apartment complex. It's the same, not the same flower, but like they were just flowers I found outside my apartment complex, and I thought they were pretty.
Great. Okay. So again, we'll look at the extremes here. So 1/250th of a second at f4, and then a 40th of a second at f. We'll do f25 is fine. Shoot. Okay, sorry. Okay, so looks as if the ISO changed, but we'll survive with that. All right, never mind, sorry. So the image on the left made it a 40th of a second at f18, and the image on the right, 1/250th of a second at f4. So the image on the left made with a slower shutter speed and a smaller aperture, so letting more light in through the shutter, less light in through the aperture. The image on the right, a 2/50th of a second at f4, so a fast shutter speed with less light coming in through the shutter, and a larger aperture, so more light coming in through the shutter. And the difference between these two, there's nothing really moving, but we can see quite a difference in the depth of field, how much is in focus from the foreground to the background. And so the image on the left with the smaller aperture, 18, gives us relatively great depth of field. So the point of focus, the flowers, that area is in focus, and the background is in pretty sharp focus as well. Whereas in the image on the right, where a large aperture was used, f4, the point of focus is still in focus, hopefully, but the background has fallen out of focus because, again, a large aperture gives us shallow depth of field. And we have to use a large aperture, which lets in more light, to compensate for having used a fast shutter speed, which lets in less light. So good job on these guys. and ISO. So again, we'll look at the extremes. The upper left, the ISO is 100, and the lower right, the ISO looks as if it is 3200. Okay, and so the exposure is a little different. I think that perhaps you ran out of f-stops maybe. But you can see both a change in the depth of field, of course, because in order to compensate for having changed the ISO, either the aperture or the shutter speed will change. And in this case, the aperture did. And in terms of the quality, actually 3200 looks quite good. But when you come in really close, you start to see some grain, but it's actually still really pretty high quality. So you really haven't lost too much in terms of detail and getting noise and artifacts and so on. Okay. Anything else to say?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Isabel. Nice job. Okay, next person who is here. Who's here? Okay, let's go to Jessica. Huh, could have sworn I saw your images here. It's odd. Hang on.
It says on my images that they're submitted, but it doesn't have any information or comments that I can see
Oh, I see.
on the Canvas app.
I see why. Because, all right, they were downloaded, but I think I didn't realize that within they were zipped. So let me just open them quickly. And we'll take a look at them. Okay, so
Sorry, I definitely had some technical challenges.
no worries. It's a brave new world for all of us, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so can you guys see these images? A lovely little girl with a cat.
Yeah.
Okay, tell us about them.
This is the business right next to my house, and my 6-year-old was readily available to take photos, and the neighborhood cat was not intentionally in the photos, but made his way into some of them.
That's great. I'm just curious, did you tell her to look down, or she was just looking, kind of looking
I-
down?
I did tell her to look down because she kept she's dramatic and she kept doing weird poses, and I just kind of wanted to keep the images simple.
Right.
So I just told her to look down instead of doing a million different facial expressions.
Mhm. My 12-year-old still does that. Okay, so I would like to have seen you do two different separate situations for the two.
Yeah, so
That's, that's
yeah,
it.
I didn't read it properly, I guess. I kind of thought that I was doing the same images for all the things, but after seeing everybody else's images, I'm like, oh, well, I guess not.
All right. We can certainly see the change in the exposure. I love this one where the cat is rubbing up and.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, in terms of bracketing, they look great. The overexposure, obviously very overexposed, and yet in a way it kind of works nicely. And that's not always true of over and especially underexposure, but it gives it a kind of dreamy effect, that I think in this case works rather well. The, in the the underexposed images, because actually it's not a really high contrast situation, which is fine.
Yeah.
The underexposure just doesn't really work. It's just too dark across the board.
Mhm.
And the normal works great. Um, yeah. Yeah, lovely. Um, in terms of composition, the only thing I say is, and this is more of a pet peeve of mine, but take it for
Yeah.
what it is. You cut off her feet, and
Yeah.
I think for myself, it would work better either. Well, I would like to see the feet, but if you don't include the feet, then come in a little closer so it looks purposeful, if that makes sense to you.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
maybe something more, more like that, where you've
Okay.
purposely
Yeah.
cut it off. Um, so something to think about, because we all,
Mhm.
when we're photographing, we tend to look more at the subject, at the center, and don't necessarily pay as much attention to the edges, what's going on. So if you have time, something to pay attention to. Now, if you're photographing an action thing and things are happening very quickly, if you start paying attention to whether you've gotten the tip of someone's toe, obviously you'll miss the whole thing, right? So
Yeah.
it is not of the utmost importance, especially when you can come in and crop. But when you have time, it does, I think it is a good idea to look at the whole frame and see if you need all of that information, or if you need more, or if tilting the camera in a certain way would improve the image. Okay. Okay. Let's see here. So these are showing changes in ISO.
Hmm.
So let's look at this one. And information. And for some reason, with some of the images that were loaded, the metadata, that is the information embedded in the file that is about the image, didn't come through. And I have no idea why, but there you have it. So I can't
Oh,
tell what the ISO ratings and the settings were here. That's one reason I'd like you guys to entitle the images with that information. So
so I did do that on Lightroom, but I guess when I uploaded them, it didn't transfer. But all of the images that I did on Lightroom, I individually titled for like ISO, whatever it was, and bracket -1. But I don't, I
oh
don't
well.
know what
The
happened here.
ways of the ether are mysterious. Um, okay, so let's assume that, let's see here, that the first one has the lowest
I can pull
ISO
it up.
rating, maybe.
I can pull it up on my phone too, I think, at the
No.
same time I tell you.
And then this one. Oh, definitely. Yeah. Oops, that's too far. But we can see, I don't know what the specific ISO rating is, but look how much grainier that one is. The face, everything is made up of little dots, right? Whereas
This one's ISO 100, I guess.
okay, 100, and this one is really smooth, and you really can't see very much, very many dots or very much grain at all. Whereas in this last one, it's kind of what the image is about, almost. This graininess. Okay, good. And So equivalent exposures.
The first one is f5.6 with an ISO of 200.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And look at this last one. And so I would expect to see a little change in the depth of field, but because, of course, your daughter, the child, is standing really pretty close to the background, there isn't a lot of space, which is fine, between the foreground and background. So we're not going to see a huge change in that respect. But it looks as if in terms of exposure, this one is a little more out of focus in the background, but in terms of exposure, they're pretty close. One of them's a little darker, but they're pretty close. Yeah, good. Okay, good. Thank you very much. And I'll get those loaded into my.
Thank you. Sorry.
All right. So, who else do we have here? Let's see. Um, 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 um. Sorry. Oh, Grace. Okay. Okay, Grace, you are here, yes? Speak to us.
Hi.
Hi. So, tell us a little about your images.
I was sick the day I had to finish the project, so I couldn't leave the house or my bed. So I just kind of tried to work with what I had near me. One of the issues I ran into with bracketing is that my camera is over a decade old, so there's not any real instructions that you can find on the internet or even in the instruction manual about how to bracket. So I'm not entirely sure I did it correctly, but I tried to adjust the settings. It looked like a grid and the dots were moving afar apart or close together based off of the way that you use the camera. So I think it turned out correctly, but I'm not sure.
Hang on. Okay, so it looks as if nothing actually changed in terms of the exposure, not very much. What did change is actually looks as if the colors changed a little. So let's see what the metadata here says, if anything. Not helpful. But what I'd like you to do is, it looks as if you had the camera in the manual setting, which is good. And if can you guys see this metadata that I've got my cursor over to the right? Can you guys see the settings? It says dimensions, cropped, exposure, exposure bias. Where it says exposure bias, it says 0 EV. And that would be the normal, doing what the light meter says is correct. So when you look into your viewfinder in your camera, usually in the lower part of the window, when you lightly tap the shutter release button, some information should come up, and it should, as this is your normal image doing what the light meter says is correct, it should indicate that you are exposing correctly, that it's not at a -1 or -2 or +1, +2. What you need to do is find the plus minus button somewhere on your camera's body, hold it in, and then for the next two images, purposely over and underexpose. You can do that. Or, since you're in the manual mode, you can just change either the aperture or the shutter speed to purposely over or underexpose. So to overexpose from 0.4 seconds, roughly half a second at f5.6, you could open the aperture up to f4, which is the next stop open, and that would overexpose. And then to underexpose relative to this, you would stop down the aperture to f8, keeping the shutter speed the same. Okay. The shutter speed is a little slow, only in terms of hand holding, so you may start to show some body motion. And what you could do, since you're inside, is increase the ISO rating to 800 or 1600, because the higher, the more sensitive the rating, the less light you need. And so that would allow you to use a somewhat faster shutter speed. Okay. But in some way you need to change the exposure, either by, in the manual mode, actually changing the aperture shutter speed, or using the exposure compensation dial and doing a +1 and a -1. Okay. Your camera may or may not have a bracketing setting, but it's okay if it doesn't. All right. If it does and you find it, then you can set the parameters to be, a stop in either direction or 2 stops in either direction. Okay.
An older version of bracketing, because it did say the specs that they had bracketing, but it wasn't very clear how to set it up versus like shooting on a T3i, which has like very clear settings and instructions on how to bracket.
Right. And some even newer ones are more or less clear than others in how to go about doing things. And also some manuals just kind of suck, Some of them are better than others, unfortunately. Okay, good. Let's take a look at your excuse me, equivalent exposures. And those look good. Let's see. You didn't need the intermediate aperture settings, so just the whole stop settings, f4, and then you could go to f5.6 and f8, f11. Okay.
F-stop on my camera is like not clear. It doesn't show the F over the f-stop at all. You have to basically just manually do it, and it will show like it's. Let me see if I can like show you. And
Sure.
it's really confusing. It took me like an hour to find the f-stop. Like it will show up in brackets, but it's like there's no F to show what it is, and it'll show a different number than what it actually should be. It'll be like, I know what the shutter speed is, and then the f-stop will be like 29 over 110, and then like then it'll go up or down, or it'll be like 20 over 110 or 14 over 101. So I don't know if that's correct or not.
So I think it's telling you the shutter speed and the aperture settings without indicating which is which, and without telling you that one is a fraction, which helps to know. But so what is probably most helpful in the long run is to learn the numbers, especially the aperture numbers, because then you know the other ones are the shutter speeds. But the aperture ones are always different than the shutter speed. So 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22, 32 are the whole stop numbers. Okay. But there are a lot of in-between intermediate ones. Some lenses have half stop increments. Others have 1/3 stop increments. But all cameras, all lenses have those whole stop numbers, the ones I gave you in the lecture.
They have the whole stop. They also have the 3rd stop. I think that's
right.
why. photos, and then I know what the shutter speed is. It's on the left. So I think the thing that confused me was that there's no F in front of the aperture.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that, yeah, because when they're just numbers there, they don't mean that much.
What are the
Uh, so, as I said, once you learn them, then you recognize what they are. But anyway, you certainly made equivalent exposures here. My only point was you didn't need to make as many. So let's take a look at do F4 and whatever this one is. So F4 and F29, and in terms of exposure, they're essentially the same. It's a little difficult. Let's see. Here we go. Let's do that. So the reason that it's out of focus is more because of the shutter speed than a change in depth of field, though there is a change in depth of field. But because you had to use such a long or slow shutter speed at f29, 1.3 seconds, it's almost impossible not to record some motion of your own body. And even at 1/25 of a second at f4, the image on the left, depending on how still you are, you may or may not show some motion at 1/25 of a second. And we're all different. So some of us can hold a camera still for much longer than others. If you're an espresso drinker, and are a little twitchy, the fastest or slowest shutter speed you may be able to keep steady at is maybe like 1/125 of a second. I've seen images made at 1 second that are really still with the photographer hand holding. I can't do that. About the slowest shutter speed I can use and still have the image relatively sharp is about 1/30th of a second, so about a little faster than what you used here. And at 1.3 seconds, you wouldn't be able to see what it was with the way I can keep cannot keep the camera steady. So that's something that we all have to kind of determine on our own. But in terms of back to equivalent exposures, these work well. And ISO, it looks as if here, because and here's why, because you were in the shutter priority mode, the camera I think didn't have anywhere to go when you changed the ISO. So what's happening is it's odd. Actually, I would have expected to see it go the other way.
I only have those ISOs too.
That's fine.
Yeah, it doesn't have any more than that because it's so old.
That's fine. I think that if you had used started with maybe a slightly faster shutter speed, they would have been closer to the same. But it's mostly the first two that are off relative to the others. So it just didn't have enough. As you said, it doesn't have enough latitude. It doesn't go to a wider aperture, or maybe I'm not sure what your shutter speeds are, the available shutter speeds are, but it just couldn't get there at the lowest ISO rating. But with these three at 400, 800, and 1600, the exposures are the same. And so that is certainly doing what I expected it to do. That as you increase the ISO rating, you require less light, and so the camera compensates by changing, in this case, the aperture and going to a smaller aperture because less light is needed. So, okay, good. And tell me again what camera you have, Grace?
I have a Level XT like from 2007.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it is definitely old. It still, I'm sure, makes fine images, but obviously, especially with electronics, things change so quickly. You know. Okay.
Compact flash instead of an SD card, so I had to get a very special adapter for it.
What's irritating also is that the compact flash cards, even though most cameras don't use them anymore, they cost more. So, anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Good job. And let me see who else is here. Okay. Minmini, did I say that correctly?
Yeah, I'm here. It was
Okay.
good.
So, talk to us, speak to us about your images. Here are your bracketing images.
Okay, so first of all, I couldn't really figure out a lot of the parts of the camera because we actually lost the instructions manual, so I was looking online for a lot of things. But I think other than that, everything worked out okay. I'm not sure if I did everything right or not.
You're not sure what? Sorry?
I'm not sure if I did everything right or not.
Well, it looks as if you did here anyway. So, yeah. So this is a +1, a -1, and doing what the camera said is correct.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And again, in the normal, the normal will often just, it'll be kind of like a compromise almost, if you have extremes, which you do here. So everything looks okay. The shadows are a little dark, the highlights a little bright, but okay. Here in the underexposure, the the highlights, the sky, that looks great, well exposed. Then both the midtones and the shadows, of course, go dark. In the overexposure, the sky is way too bright, but the shadows have opened up nicely. So again, it's kind of a compromise there. And the same with the lower set. So you did a +1, -1, and we can see the same things are true. The normal looks good. It's perhaps the tiniest bit dark, and that's because there's such bright highlights. The light meter was kind of drawn to them, even though they're in the background.
Mm-hmm.
Here with the underexposure, then the highlights start to look a little better, though they're so bright. Those areas are so bright that you'd probably need at least a -2 to get real detail in there, and then the foreground would be very dark. And the +1, now the foreground's just a little too bright. The shadows look good, and of course the highlights are blasted out. They're too bright. Okay. So tell us about your equivalent exposures.
Uh, so for these ones, I was a little confused about like the full stops because I don't think mine went higher than 32, and I don't know if that was all right or not. But
Absolutely, that's fine.
um, but when I was taking these, I just noticed that they would get progressively like blurrier, and I wasn't sure if that's because I was moving more as I took them, or
So what happened was, first of all, you've done an overexposure, I think. So that's a +1, which worked out fine in terms of the image. That's not a big deal, but it did kind of suck up one of your uh, either the shutter speed or the aperture. Let's see, an aperture priority. So um, because you're forcing it to overexpose by one stop,
mm-hmm.
um, what you have here a 40th of a second at f5.6, if it had been at normal, it would be like an 80th of a second. So you kind of lose a stop there, which is, I mean, it's not a big deal, but that's part of the reason these get progressively blurrier, and that is because you're an aperture priority,
Mm-hmm.
or at least you were in the first one. Let's see, yeah. And you have a really high ISO here, which is also fine. Because the aperture is set, it's the shutter speed that changes.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to slower and slower shutter speeds.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. And you also changed, no. Okay, yeah. So the ISO changed a bit as well, did it? No, it's the same. What am I saying? So as you go to the slower shutter speeds, and here 1.6 seconds, or essentially a second and a half, you can no longer keep the camera still for that long. And that's why they're out of focus. So actually the depth of field is greater back there, but because you're moving the camera, you can't help it. You can't see that the
Yeah.
field is great. But you certainly did, I mean, you certainly did the assignment correctly. Absolutely. So the exposures are essentially the same. You've changed the aperture. You know, that's was your priority, and so of course the shutter speed has to change as well, to compensate for the change in the aperture. So yeah, you did a fine job on those.
Wait, so for higher apertures, should I like set the camera down somewhere before taking like instead of holding it?
Right. So yeah, with a small aperture, for example, this one at f32,
Mm-hmm.
because the aperture is so small, you have to let a lot of light in through the shutter.
Uh-huh.
Use a slow shutter speed. And so yes, stabilizing the camera would be what you'd want to do. Either setting it down on a table or anything stable, a tripod, you know. In that way, yes, then the image would be sharp in terms of motion, at least in terms of your motion. Now, like if this wind chime
Mm-hmm.
was moving in the wind,
Yeah.
that motion would still be recorded, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because for however long the shutter is open, whatever's going on in front of the camera is recorded. And if that thing is moving, then the motion's recorded. But anything that's not moving will be still if you've stabilized the camera. Okay.
Okay.
And ISO. So let's see here. That's ISO 100. And ISO 25,600. So because you're in shutter priority, well, that's okay. It's the images got lighter, progressively lighter,
Yeah.
and possibly if you'd started with a slightly slower shutter speed, maybe 1/1000th of a second or so, or 1/500th of a second,
Uh-huh.
then your camera would have had kind of more room to move as you change the ISO rating. Okay.
Okay.
Now, what I can see, I guess here, what time of day was it when you made these images? 6
It was like evening.
Right.
Kind of
So it
stuff.
wasn't. So it wasn't this dark,
Yeah, it wasn't supposed to be this dark, but
right? But probably not quite. Well, maybe something like here. Yeah. So it's with the lower, slightly lower ISOs where you require more light. And the camera, the at this setting, the camera's set at a 4,000th of a second at f 4.2. It looks as if 4.2 is the maximum aperture you can make use of at the focal length you're using.
uh-huh.
So, and because you're in shutter priority, the shutter speed is set at 1/4000th. And so the camera has nowhere to go. So when you change the ISO to lower ratings, which require more light, it can no longer compensate because the shutter speed is set at 1/4000th. And what it really needed to do was open up to a 2000th and then 1/1000th and then 1/500th of a second as you change the ISO rating. So that's why these first ones are darker than the last ones. Okay. Which is not necessarily something that it's not something we're more knowing that you have to do that. But within those parameters, these are fine. They work well for showing a change in ISO. Okay. Any comments or anything else you want to say about your?
Not really.
No? Okay. You don't have to. I'm just checking in there. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minnie. Let's see who else is here. Robert or Bob? Which do you prefer?
I prefer Robert.
Robert, you got it. Okay. Okay. Let's take a look at your images. What do you have to say for yourself, Robert?
I mean, I just went to this like neighborhood. It's
Mhm.
it's called Communication Hills, if you know where that is.
I don't.
But yeah, it's like pretty much a really nice community. Like on top of like these hills in the middle of San Jose. I just went up there and just like walked around and just took some pics.
All right. I really like your vantage point. I like that you know, looked up, and I love what happens to the shapes. You know, with these curves, it kind of undulates around the frame in a really beautiful way. So let's see here, 500th at f 3.5, 1/1000th, which is what, a plus like 3 stops almost. No, what am I saying? One plus a -1 stop and a +1. Okay, and in this case, actually, I think that the +1 overall works the best in terms of exposure. The highlights are a little bright, but because the mid ground and the shadows are so dark relative to the highlights, I think that this image, the normal one, brings the highlights down nicely, but then everything else is really pretty dark. And so, I think that the overexposure works best in overall terms. And in the lower, you certainly have a high contrast situation. And normal shows us the compromise that works pretty well. The highlights are bright, the shadows are dark, but in the -1 and +1, those extremes kind of overwhelm the image. So, all right, nice job. Tell us about your equivalent exposures.
Oh, oh yeah, in the comment section of like the assignment,
Mm-hmm.
said I didn't use whole stop F numbers, but um I actually did, but when I'm looking at my pictures in preview, like the numbers go from like it goes up to 9, but my camera goes up to 22 for the aperture.
So I guess I probably didn't word it correctly then. What I meant was it's not that you don't have the whole stop numbers here. It's that you, in addition to those, you have the intermediate stops, which you don't need. Okay. So
What do
for
you mean?
uh, so F4, F5, you don't need. Well, I guess it should be F5.6. Hang on.
I
F
mean,
F9, F10 are intermediate f stops. So it would go from F8 to F11. And then you don't need F13 and 14. It goes from F11 to F16. F18 and 20, you don't need, just to 22. So what I'm saying is you don't need to have made as many exposures or handed as many in. I wanted to see like F4, F5.6, F8, F11,
oh
F16, and F22. So you don't
yeah,
need those intermediate ones.
yeah, you said use like the whole stop numbers like 4 or 5, like just like without a decimal point afterwards, like integers. So that's what I thought you had to do. Just like so I use like whole numbers instead
That,
of like
I'm sorry,
5.6.
because no, that's not what I meant. So I must have worded it incorrectly. I apologize. So if you look at the list of numbers that I gave, both in the assignment and also if you look at the, and this is for everyone, not just you, Robert, um, in the notes that I gave you whole stop numbers. And that is because some cameras and lenses have, they all have in between incremental settings or stops, but some use half stop settings and others use 1/3 stop settings. But they all have these whole stop numbers. So they all have F8, F11, F16, F22. Some lenses open up further than others. Some go to F2, others don't. Some lenses go beyond F22 to F32 or beyond, others don't. But within those parameters, they have those whole stop numbers. And with the shutter speeds as well, there are intermediate shutter speeds, but all cameras have 1 second, a half second, a quarter of a second, an eighth of a second, and so on. Some have also a third of a second, a sixth, a ninth. Others have other increments in between, but they all have those whole stop numbers. And so those are the ones I want you to use to learn for the class, and in this particular assignment to use for that assignment. That's
Wait, so what exactly are whole stop numbers though?
so they.
It's just like 2 times the light.
That's correct. Where that
Oh,
relationship um, holds true for,
oh, okay.
okay, so that when you change, for example, when you change the aperture from f8 over here to f11, f11 lets in half as much light as f8. If you go to an intermediate f stop, which is like f9 and a half, then the amount of light that is changed is not, it's not one half or doubled. It's like a third or maybe a quarter, it depends on if you're a third of a stop or half stop. And it gets a little more difficult to figure those out. And so in photography, we tend to use the whole stops to judge relationships and the amount of light. And photographers can generally identify after a while how much the image is overexposed by or underexposed by, and we think of them in stops. So,
Oh,
we can tell if it's less than a stop or in either direction, but we learn them in terms of stops because the relationships are much more straightforward, uh, you know, in figuring
so
it out.
for the whole stop numbers, it's 4, 5.6, 8, 11, and 16, 22.
Yes,
Right.
and then 32.
Okay.
Every other number doubles or is
Every other. Mhm.
F5.6 to F11 has been rounded off to F instead of 11.2. It should be. It's rounded to 11, but they double or cut in half every other number. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So that said, these images look great. In terms of equivalent exposures, they are essentially identical. So in terms of light and dark, the image on the left was made at a 1/320th of a second, which is an intermediate stop at f4, and then 1/10 of a second at f22. And what we'd expect to see a change in here is depth of field. The ISO remained the same. So in terms of depth of field, we can see some difference. Because everything is further away, um, you won't see as much of a change. Also, 1/10 of a second is not quite as sharp because it's a slow shutter speed as 1/20th of a second, and you can see that it's really quite crisp um, in terms of the overall sharpness of the image, and that's because of the shutter speed. But in terms of the exposure, they're the same. Okay, let me get out of that and go to ISO. And with ISO, you can think of the ISO ratings in terms of stops as well. So the numbers double or are cut in half. And that relates specifically to the light requirement, the sensitivity, and the light requirement. So these also look great in terms of exposure. They're all essentially the same. So we'll just compare ISO 100 to ISO 6400. And we can see that there's more grain. It's a slightly grittier, grainier image with 6400 ISO, the image on the right, as opposed to 100 ISO, the image on the left. Okay. There's also a difference in the sharpness because of the change in the shutter speed. So at ISO 100, a lot more light is required, and I assume you're shooting in aperture priority. So the aperture is at f25, which is very small aperture. And because a lot of light is required, the camera then used a slow shutter speed, 1/3 of a second, roughly. At ISO 6400, a much more sensitive ISO rating that requires less light, you could make use of 1/200th of a second, a much faster shutter speed, and so in terms of motion, the image is stable. Okay. Anything you want to say, Robert?
Not really. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much. Good job. All right. And what else do we have here? KU. Let's see here. KU and Dylan, Ruben, Thomas. That's odd. All right, just a moment. Sorry, I'll get there. Okay, KU, are you here? Hello? KU? Am I saying it correctly? KEYU. Is your sound turned on?
I don't think they have a microphone.
Ah, there we go. Now we can hear you. No? Oh, that wasn't KU. Sorry. No microphone, KU? Okay, we'll assume that was so and just take a quick look at these. So these actually are, I guess, two different situations, kind of. One thing I want to point out is what's called the color temperature, the shift in that. And that is something we'll talk about next time. And you can see the images on the top have a more yellow gold light than the images on the bottom. And so the color temperature is different, and we'll talk about that next time. So we can certainly see a change in the exposure, a -1, +1, and normal here. And we see what happens with the highlights, the change in the highlights. Here. And in terms of the shadows. In both sets. Okay. So that's a +1 and a -1. Okay, good. So go to equivalent exposures. So from F4 to F22. And in terms of exposure, that's great. They're all the same. So F4 here, a large aperture giving us somewhat more shallow depth of field. And then, sorry, I keep getting the spinner, which is really irritating. And at F22, you can see there was a shift, and now this area in the upper left, which is closest to the lens, is in focus, as well as the background, or the area furthest from the frame, down here in these steps and the pavement. So again, F22 gives us much greater depth of field than here at F4, where the foreground, the area in the upper left, falls out of field, out of focus, excuse me. All right, good job on that. And ISO. So let's do these two, 100 and 3200. Come on. And so at 3200, we're beginning to see some noise and, some artifacts here. We're at 100, if we ever get back there. It's really quite smooth, and we can hardly see any, I don't see any artifacts really. Okay. So, nice job on those, KU. I'm sorry we can't hear you. Alright. Okay, Dylan.
Hello.
Hi there. So, speak to. So, tell us about these images.
It was just random stuff I found around, like just situations around my house.
Why did you choose to change the ISO for the bracketing?
I think that was not intended.
So, how did you
I
then?
didn't realize.
How did you get the change in the exposures, or how had you intended to get the change?
I just intended to make it -1, 0, and then +1 for the for the exposure.
So you're in shutter priority. Um, and did you physically change the ISO rating?
I might have accidentally.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because it's not. It doesn't appear to be accidental. It looks
Uh,
like that is the method that you used, which worked to
okay.
change the um, the exposure. So the +1 was achieved by changing the ISO. Although I would have expected it to be the other direction, but so this image uses an ISO of 1600. This one 800, and this one actually 4000, which is a little bit a stop and a half greater than ISO 1600. So as you guys can see, you can also use changing the ISO to change the exposure, because as you change the ISO rating, the light requirement changes. So presumably this image at ISO 1600 was doing essentially what the light meter wanted to be done. At 800, more light is required but was not given. So the exposure in terms of aperture and shutter speed stayed the same. And so because the ISO was decreased and required more light but didn't have it, it became underexposed. And then with the higher ISO rating, which requires less light, because the settings weren't changed, it's now overexposed. Okay. So whether you intended it or not, this did work in terms of bracketing. With the lower set, uh, the this one is the lightest. It says it's a +1. So you're in the shutter priority mode at a 40th of a second. And so at f8, this is doing, whoops, what the camera says is correct. At f9, which is not actually a -1, but kind of like minus a third, or minus a half, not quite. It is somewhat darker, and they're all a little dark because the light meter decided that the proper area of exposure is the sky, which is much brighter than the foreground. And so,
Yeah.
in order to expose correctly for the sky, letting less light in, the darker areas become even darker. Okay. So it's only in the overexposure here that we're beginning to see a little detail in the shadow areas. Right. and probably a +2 at least is what would have been needed to really get a little more detail in the shadow areas. So if we went up like that, now we can see the details in the shadow areas pretty well. But the sky is totally blasted out. We would not have known that there was this beautiful, this beautiful subtle setting sun, or twilight sky. Okay. Let me just undo that so I don't think that it is. All right. Okay, so tell us about your equivalent exposures.
I just went outside and took pictures of my flowers in front of my house.
Okay. And what changed here?
It got progressively darker, I think, or it went from dark to light.
So what I want to see with equivalent exposures is all of them the same in terms of light and dark.
Okay.
Let's see, you're in manual, and this looks about right in terms of exposure. So what I would want to see here is keeping maybe the ISO the same, and as you change the aperture, change the shutter speed as well. Right. But what's happening here is that you kept the shutter speed the same, and as you changed the aperture, to a certain extent, you were able to change the ISO to compensate. But after f11 at ISO 6400, 6400 is the maximum ISO rating your camera has. And so when you change from f11 to f16, the camera can now no longer compensate by increasing the ISO rating. And so the images get darker from there.
Okay.
So you might try putting the camera in shutter priority or aperture priority, and then the camera generally won't allow you to expose incorrectly or not as much. Okay. So if you start with an ISO, sorry, I have a bug here, ISO of wherever you started, 125 or 100, maybe here at f5.6, or even small, larger, maybe f4. That should give you at least one more stop.
Okay.
And let's look at your equivalent your ISO images. Okay, and yeah, those look great. Do you want to say anything about them?
Oh, nothing much. It's just my girlfriend.
Beautiful. You did a very nice job.
Thank you.
Let's just take a look at the lowest and highest ISO ratings here. Let me just. So the image on the left, ISO 100, with an aperture of f4, and then the image on the right, ISO 3200, the aperture of f20. You can see that the background is subtly more in focus in the image on the right, the higher ISO and the smaller aperture. But you can also see, I think, that you're starting to get these funny little colors. If you look at the pattern of the wall or wood behind the, the wall, I guess, behind, um, you can see these subtle areas of purple and green and blue that you don't really see in the image on the left. And so with the higher ISO rating, you start to get these colors that don't really belong there. In terms of the graininess, it's not bad at 3200. There is somewhat more, grain. You can see these spots more, but it's really in what's called chromatic aberration, a bending of the colors that we can see that the ISO rating has changed. Okay. Anything else you want to say about the image?
Thank you.
All right.
That's just simple. Thank you.
What's that?
Oh, just nothing. Just thank you.
All right. One thing in terms of the composition, I think it works really nicely that you included the window here. I think it's balanced well. Maybe you don't need quite as much information on the right side of the image. So, come on, Lightning. Goodness, it's acting so slow today. So, I might come in a little closer and dump a little of that information, maybe like so. I like having that window there. It breaks up the frame, but I don't think you need quite as much information on the other side, with the rest of the wall just kind of empty. So,
Okay.
and that's just as with all of them, they're suggestions,
Yeah.
but something to think about, if you do need all of that information. Let me just get this out of the way so I can get back here and reset. So that's the original. Okay, nice job. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thanks.
And who else do we have here? Ruben and Thomas and Cecilia. Okay. Ruben, speak to us.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi there. Tell us about your images.
I just took some pictures of the guitars on my wall.
What a beautifully colored guitar. Both of them are nice, but so what did you change in order to change the exposure?
I changed the shutter speed.
Okay, good. Okay, so this one is normal, +1, and -1. Which one works best for you?
I think I prefer the -1 because then I can, if I go into Lightroom, I can bring out all the shadows and I get more detail. Or sometimes when you overexpose, you can lose detail.
True, very true. Though if you underexpose too much, you lose it too. But in terms of the appearance, is the dark one the one you like best?
Oh, well, no. I mean, I like the normal one best.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay. For the guitar itself, I like the plus one. I think it really pops it out a lot. It's true that the highlights now are too bright, but I like the colors are intense, and what I really like is that the lightning on the strap really pops out. But you're right that these things can be manipulated in Lightroom, absolutely. And the same for the second set. Um, oh shoot, I keep doing that. Sorry. So you're using the manual setting, and you feel, I assume, it sounds as if you have some background in Lightroom and photography. Is that so?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Bit? Okay. Um, so you feel comfortable shooting in the manual mode?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, and with this set also, I would say in overall terms, the overexposure works really nicely. And it's certainly true that the normal and the underexposed ones can be worked on easily. But in this case, and that's not always the case, but in this case, I think the overexposure works well. If you were just going to use the image unmanipulated, you know. The color grade of the wall also works really nicely to showcase the, uh, the guitars very nicely. Um, in terms of composition, I might dump this whatever this little piece of is it a speaker? I can't tell.
It's a fan.
A fan. Oh, so it is. Anyway, I might move the fan out of the way. But aside from that, it works really nicely. Okay. Okay, tell us about your equivalent exposures.
Well, I just went out to my backyard and found a flower and just took a bunch of photos of it.
Okay. So yeah. Again, you don't need the intermediate shutter speeds and or apertures, just the whole stop ones. But yeah, they're all essentially the same in terms of exposure, which is what we want to see. So here, a 60th of a second at f22, a 3200th of a second at f3.5. And so, let me just open the navigator. And so what we see a change in is really is the depth of field. So with f22 on the left, much more is in focus than is in the image on the right at f3.5. Okay. And ISO. Okay, good. So ISO 100 and ISO 6400. I'll put in close here. And so again, we can see a lot more noise or grain here than we do, hang on, at ISO 100. Okay. Excellent. Good job, Ruben. Thank you. Okay, so is Thrisha here? was earlier, but I think she has departed. So, of those of you who are remaining, I think we've looked at. Oh, Thomas, I'm sorry, but you don't. We don't have yours yet. Is that right, Thomas?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. All right. So, so for those of you who haven't turned in your work, please turn it in sooner rather than later. You are welcome to redo your work if you want to. I I always accept late work except for the final assignment, which of course is due at the end of the term, so there isn't time to redo that. But for other assignments, you may redo them if you want to, and of course I will record the higher grade and use that grade. So talk to me about it if you want, or resubmit, but let me know that you have resubmitted so I know to regrade. Okay. Any questions? Any questions or comments on this? The next assignment is also a technical assignment, and in fact, they're all technical assignments in terms of shooting. But of course, I do talk about composition and images, you know, in terms of composition and balance and so on as well. But these assignments are technical in nature. So again, the next assignment, the second assignment, hi baby, is hi sweetie, is depth of field, and so hopefully you'll be getting that assignment in, and we'll talk about that. But we after this next assignment, we probably won't spend quite as much time in detail going over every single image, but I will certainly look at everyone's work, of course, when I'm grading, but during our Zoom times, we'll certainly look at work for each assignment. But I do want to get more into now working in Lightroom. And so I, of course, went on and on this time, but on Thursday, during our Zoom meeting, that's what we'll be primarily what we'll be working on. So again, I hope that you are shooting images so that we have images, that you have images to work on in Lightroom. And I will also load images onto Canvas that we can all work on at the same time so that you can kind of follow along with what I'm going over. For those of you who do not attend the Zoom meetings, of course, these are recorded and loaded onto Canvas. So all of our lectures, with one exception, are loaded onto Canvas. And that exception is because the file became corrupted somehow. But I went over all of that same information again in the following class. So nothing is missing in the Zoom meetings in terms of information. Please keep up by doing the readings in the different modules. So you should have read everything through depth of field at this point. Okay, and I will activate the next module in a few minutes, which deals with color temperature and white balance. And so that will be our next technical topic. But we'll also, as I said, be working in Lightroom. So I hope that you are working in Lightroom, at least somewhat, and figuring out where you are in Lightroom and watching the posted little instructional videos that are there on Canvas. Okay. If you have any questions, of course, email me or come to my Zoom office hours, which are Wednesdays from 12:30 to 2:30. So tomorrow from 12:30 to 2:30. Just one moment. Let me get out of this for a moment. Not that. Okay, well, That's not what I wanted, but that's okay. Never mind. Okay, so please feel free to come to the office hour, my office hour, hours, 2 hours. Email me if you have questions or comments. And if you can't make the office hour and want to speak with me, email me and we can maybe arrange a separate Zoom time that works for you. Okay. So any questions or comments? No. Okay. Hi again, baby. Okay, in that case, have a wonderful day and keep shooting. Stay safe and see you Thursday. Okay. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Now, take care. Now, why can't I get out of this? All right.